Titus, a company with a reputation for not making the best titles around. But what if I told you they made a game that they thought was so good they put their own mascot in it? That's right, it's time for us to check out Titus the Fox. And welcome to Goldfish on Games. Titus the Fox, to Marrakesh and Back, was released in 1992 for the Amiga, but also for MS-DOS, Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, as well as the Game Boy. But it also got reported to the Game Boy Color in the year 2000. This was quite obviously made and published by Titus. The box was used for all the various computer ports, with just a different label on the corner. And inside we get the game on a single floppy disk, as well as a poster that doubles as the instructions, which actually covers the entirety of the other side as they cover all the various languages. For the most part, we will be looking at the Amiga version, but the others will get a little screen time as we go. There is no intro or even much in the way of options, we just get a title screen and then the game itself. And what we find is a fairly typical platformer, in which you have to go from left to right to make it to the exit. But it's not a Euro platformer, so we don't have to do a lot of collecting to open up that exit. Instead, it's more in the style of Mario 2, or Doki Doki Panic, or to use another Titus game, the Blues Brothers. As in, it's all about picking up objects to throw at the enemies to take them out. And while the crates and bottles will be lost after they're used, whether or not they hit anything, the enemies won't return when they're taken out, so you won't have to worry about respawning baddies. What you might find a bit more challenging, at least at first, are the controls, as Titus moves a little bit faster and is a little bit more slippery than you might expect. So they managed to combine this more methodical gameplay style with a more loose and twitchy control method that you will get used to after a while, but if you don't, then you might want to try hitting the F10 key, as that will enable a mode that will slow down the entire game, and makes this about half as fast as it would be normally. Now at first, I found that a little bit too slow, and obviously the regular movement is a little bit too fast, so somewhere in between would have been far more ideal, but I have to admit, I used this feature way more than I was expecting to, and at times I completely forgot that it could be faster. The Amiga version also has an advantage over all the other 16 bits when it comes to platforming, as it scrolls like you'd expect it to. This cannot be said for the other versions. In the DOS version, well, it has this very interesting style, as it won't scroll until you get quite near the edge of the screen. Then the new area, it will scroll into view. It's not quite flip screen, but it's not far off. And this can obviously lead to some really horrible situations, where you're trying to jump at things that are off screen, or having to deal with enemies that are off screen. This can lead to a bit of a start-stop approach to moving around the game, which I feel does take away a bit from the gameplay. But it's not all bad, as one of the things I really like about the game is the range of objects that you will find. From bouncy balls that you can jump on top of, and that will also bounce off baddies and return to you, to springs that can also launch you up. I also quite like the wheelie bins, that will zoom around the level when thrown and can be used again and again. Some of these might be required if you want to go off the beaten path and find some of the more interesting items in the game, like the flying carpet, that you can throw and then glide on, which makes for a great shortcut. Or the skateboard, that lets you just ride through baddies. There are also regular pickups that you'll find in the levels as well. These gem-like icons will top up your health, but they also have a secondary ability. If you collect 10 of them while you're at full health, and then complete the level, you will gain an extra life. There are also these padlocks, which act as checkpoints when you collect them. And also, just about every level will have this icon that will give you a password. Those of you from France might recognise this game but under a different name. Les Gaffes, Les Aventures de Mokhtar vol un la Zubita. And this was a tie-in game for a music video by the comedian Les Gaffes and their song La Zubida. That was released in 1991 and is based on one of his characters, Mokhtar. And this is all very much of its time. The music video though features computer art and animations that are very similar to the game, to the extent that I assume that Titus, or at least the artists for the game, also worked on the music video, and the developers then took inspiration from the song, such as the magic carpets and the other odd items, for the game itself. The two games, well, they're very similar, in some ways identical, as it's mostly just an art swap of the main character from Mokhtar to Titus. Now there is an extra level in this version, and it's at the very end of the game, but by all accounts it's not a particularly good level, and it's really the only tangible difference between the two. I guess that when they realised they had accidentally made a decent game, it made sense to release it internationally, but with Les Gaffes not really being known outside of France, it required them to change it up. And what else could they use but their foxy mascot? But it did require them to change up the story a bit, to make it work for this new game. As it's no longer about trying to get your girlfriend away from an overprotective parent, instead it's about trying to save Foxy, the fiancée of Titus, who was sent to the Sahara Desert to write an article for the Fox and Locks magazine, and while she was there, she was suddenly kidnapped by bandits. And it's only Titus that seems to care enough to head out to make sure she doesn't end up as an unwilling concubine. The basic premise of this can be seen through the game, as we start off in a very unforgiving town full of drunks, people with hammers, and others that just want to batter our mascot hero, before then travelling through the subways and catacombs that were full of rats, skeletons, and minecarts. Spiky minecarts. This game is great for creating new locations and enemies to deal with, as we end up in this old town that seems to be falling apart, and now we have to deal with babies that have the deadliest aim with a bottle I've ever seen, as well as old people throwing TVs at you. I'm sure there was absolutely no social commentary going on in this at all. There are 14 levels in total in the Titus edition, and the levels become significantly larger as we go along. So it's not a game that you're going to finish quickly, or even on your first attempt. I doubt you'd even finish this on your 100th attempt, not without cheats anyway, as this has a reputation for being a difficult game, and it is well deserved. And as we enter the tombs, we can really see this coming to the forefront. As one of the problems we get as we go further into the game is there's more chances of you soft locking yourself, because it's possible to lose an item that you need to progress, and your only option is to lose a life and try again. But if you're really good, then you might find some secret passages or hidden doorways that can bypass large chunks of the levels. Or in the instance of the first level, it might send you right back to the very start. And I only found out about some of the more hidden ones when I checked out the great Titus the Fox fan site. I'll leave a link in the description, as they have level maps and videos that show you how to get to some of the more obscure ones, and lots of other great advice. But by this point in the game, those shortcuts are becoming few and far between, and the game starts to get, frankly, a little sadistic with its level designs. Rooms where both the floor and the ceiling are death, where you have to make a series of perfect jumps to make it across. And with how Titus moves, this is asking a little bit much. This is slightly mitigated with how lovely the levels look, and they continue to create new art and baddies for you to deal with as you go along. But wow, they are really trying their best to make sure you don't finish the game. Thankfully, for the most part, the bosses aren't the hardest thing in the game. Yeah, it's possible to screw up against the boss and lose the item that you need to beat them, and they don't always feel like they show up at natural points in the game for one, as it never feels like it's at the end of a world, they just randomly show up. Typically, you'll have to drop something on them or throw something at them to take them out, but they do look nice, and they aren't too difficult to take down. For the most part anyway. But it was against one of the bosses that I hit a wall, as I managed to beat them no problem, but then couldn't finish the level. At first I thought I'd messed up, or there might have been a hidden doorway that I've just not found yet. But no, turns out that earlier in the level we passed by this cage, which has Foxy inside. And at the time I didn't think anything of it, as it's not the first time we've seen it, as she showed up in one of the previous boss fights, and you couldn't interact with her. But in what might be the most Titus thing I've ever seen, it turns out that we had to grab the cage and then carry it all the way to the final boss, making sure that if we touch the padlocks, that you were carrying the cage at the same time, as otherwise it will return back to where it started if you die. And can we work our way back to that tower? Well, I think you know the answer to that question. This is such a confusing game, as it's so lovely and charming in its own way at the start, and it shows a decent enough concept implemented in, well, not the best way, but it works well enough. But then it continues to ramp up the difficulty level and the platforming challenges in larger jumps than Titus's own. But just as we head towards the last few levels of the game, let's take a look at those other major ports that I mentioned. First, let's look at the Amstrad CPC 464. Which is interesting, if not just for the fact that it got a release in 1991, but also due to the fact there isn't one for the C64 or Spectrum. Now this does make some sense when you realise that the CPC was far more popular a machine in France than the others. And it is quite cool to see the 464 shining when it's not being held back by the other 8-bits, as it's nice and colourful. But it is quite obviously not as smooth as the 16-bits. There is quite a lot of slowdown, and it does get quite severe, even at the start. This version also has only 7 levels. And while they start off very similar in design to the 16-bit versions, they progressively get more and more different and quite unique in their own right. So it is an interesting version that should be checked out. Much like the 2 Game Boy ports, as again it has the basics of the game but in a changed up form. The items now get thrown in an arc and don't vanish after use, and the bouncy ball, well, it can't be used as a weapon anymore. And on top of all that, while the levels keep some of the elements of the original, they've been all completely changed. And the scrolling, while not quite as smooth as the Amiga release, is a bit better than the other ones that we've seen. Though I will say it did take a little bit of time to get used to not having to hold down and then press the fire button to pick up the object. Instead, it was just a dedicated button that you could press at any time, and holding down actually stopped you picking up items. And then we have the Game Boy Color Edition, which at first glance might look like it's different from what we've already seen. But it turns out this has 2 extra levels at the very start, and then once you get past those, it's just what we've already seen on the Game Boy version, but in colour. But I do think they could have put a bit more effort into this coloured version of the game, as Titus, well, he just looks a little bit bland, as some of the baddies have far more colour and detail going on in them than our main character, and that just feels a little bit wrong. But the levels themselves do look nice and colourful. So again, another interesting version to check out, but it wouldn't be my go-to one to start off with. And if you are interested in playing this game, then it's actually on both GOG and Steam. But it is the DOS version wrapped up in DOSBox, so it has all the weird scrolling and MIDI music rather than the mod tracks that we've been hearing. Now all of this could have been forgiven if it wasn't for the price that they were asking, as it's between £7 and £8 when not on sale. There is one other way to experience Titus the Fox, and that is to find Open Titus, which is an engine remake of Titus the Fox. But again, for some reason this one is based on the DOS version, so it has its scrolling system. It also expects its data, and for the most part I believe it also uses its music as well. But if you want to play Titus the Fox on a modern system, it is a good way to start. And with that, I feel we're at the end of this look at the adventures of Titus the Fox of Mokhtar. And until next time, I was the Goldfish. That was one of a handful of good Titus games, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I hope that if you got this far, you enjoyed the video and might consider using those buttons just down there to let YouTube know it. If you want to check out more reviews, then there should be 2 on the screen right now, as I do enjoy checking out all sorts of random games, particularly on the Amiga. And if that sounds good to you, then I hope to see you again soon.